Hi, everyone, and welcome to tonight's presentation. Tonight, we are joined by historian and Montgomery County native Ralph Bugles as he recounts the heyday of Gaithersburg's Shady Grove Music Fair in the 1960s and 70s. Reminder, please remain muted during the presentation. As always, you can send any questions you have throughout in the chat, and there will be an opportunity at the end to unmute for a Q&A. Thank you to tonight's featured sponsor, Gail Lee Homes. And if you enjoyed tonight's presentation, please make sure to check out our website and register to join us again next week. Without further ado, Ralph, take it away.
Okay, I'm just getting set up here. And did I share my screen?
You'll have to start sharing your screen again.
Okay, sorry. That's what I was afraid that I failed to do. Sorry for this delay. Usually I have everything all set. So I hope now that you are seeing the title screen here, Shady Grove Music Fair, and that you're in the right place. I hope that you have come to relive some memories. I hope many of you attended performances at Shady Grove and have indeed fond memories. As I've given this talk at various spots, of course, that's often the case. And I usually have to start by saying that I can't go into every show that was there, every singer, every comedian, every event, but I hope to give a representative sampling, mention some of the ones that were especially big names or out of the ordinary, but mostly I hope to give an overview of Shady Grove's time on the scene, and especially why it was relatively short-lived, in operation only from 1962 until 1978. And so people who are relative newcomers to the county, if you mention Shady Grove Music Fair, have don't even know what you're talking about. But it was quite an institution in its time and brought big stars to Gaithersburg. Once a major performance venue in the county. Here are its various logos in just its 16 years of existence, but more importantly, it had two iterations structurally. It started out in this tent. It was strictly a summer venue in a tent for 5 years, between 1962 and 1966, and then was replaced by a permanent structure. Both were theaters in the round with a center stage. Now here's a look inside, sort of. I'll explain what I mean later. But it had, as I said, a circular stage completely surrounded by the audience. And the stage actually rotated so that everyone had a head-on view at least some of the time. The stage made a complete rotation in about 15 minutes, so a slow but noticeable movement. And the venue could be configured to use only half of the space, with one side curtained off and the stage stationary. The number of seats, I've seen varying numbers, most likely around 2,800. So for comparison, Strathmore Grand Concert Hall has just under 2,000 seats. So Shady Grove was the largest venue in Montgomery County, you might say ever or so far. Its two main offerings were musicals, mainly recent Broadway hits and revivals, and concerts by a wide range of musicians. Here's a quote from one person who was there in the early days: major actors, singers, dancers who gave extraordinary performances. And here's one concert goer's rave: best up close and personal rock experience I had. Now, once it went hardtop, as it was called, the permanent structure, Shady Grove indeed attracted some pretty big name singers.
Hello, darkness, my old friend.
I hope you heard the sampling of songs there. I remembered to share sound, right?
Yes, sounds great.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you, Dottie. So perhaps the biggest, at least what many people remember, the Jackson 5. So they appeared at Shady Grove, 1975, 7 nights. And just a year before they were at Shady Grove, they had filled the Astrodome and RFK Stadium. 2 years earlier was their world tour. It's quite astounding that they played 7 nights at Shady Grove. Some performers were hard to pin down for just one night, you might say. This ticket stub is sort of a collector's item because Sly and the Family Stone moved up the date of their Shady Grove show by a day to October 26th at the last minute. So no time to reprint the tickets that say October 27th, as you see here. According to Wikipedia, Sly and the Family Stone were notorious for suddenly pulling out of gigs or changing dates like this. So entertainers of all sorts, comedians, flamboyant showmen like Liberace, blues, country-ish, MOR singers, as the expression was, middle of the road, like Andy Williams, the quintessential smooth singer. And a singer in the same style was touted in this radio ad.
Tony Bennett, the man Frank Sinatra called the best singer in the business, comes to the Shady Grove Music Fair accompanied by the big band sound of Buddy Rich. Come out to Shady Grove to enjoy the magic drums of Buddy Rich and Tony Bennett's hits.
So some of these performers gave shows that might seem uncharacteristic to us today. For example, Woody Allen in '72, stand-up comedy with Jim Croce, an interesting pairing, as was this one, Buddy Hackett and James Darren. Also, Gypsy, the story of Gypsy Rose Lee, a burlesque stripper, starred Angela Lansbury in 1975, who's probably best known today for a quite different TV series. But Shady Grove's bread and butter, you might say, musicals, mostly Broadway shows, recent ones or revivals, even some classics.
Doe, a deer, a female deer, Ray, a drop of golden sun.
No, it wasn't Julie Andrews at Shady Grove, but Gloria DeHaven, first in 1964, later Barbara Eden of I Dream of Jeannie fame, and Shirley Jones of the Partridge Family, all starring in various performances of The Sound of Music. And many other big name actors, Robert Goulet, Carol Channing, others. Here are a few playbills so that you can judge for yourself. Some of the other stars. Okay, just a sampling of the many playbills. A mixed bag. Sometimes some up and coming stars, at the time at least, Stiller and Mira. And, well, let's be blunt, some performers who, well, had been around for quite a while. And here on the left, This Was Burlesque was actually the show that came back the most number of years at Shady Grove. 6 times if you count its last iteration under a slightly different name. The second most show was Sound of Music. And among musicians, the most frequent were the Four Seasons, 6 times. So maybe we should call them the 6 seasons. Sharing top billing is the group that performed the most times, also 6 times, tied with the Four Seasons. The Temptations.
It was just my imagination running away.
So that's singers, also comedians. Among comedians, Victor Borga, who joked around while playing a piano, appeared 5 out of Shady Grove's 16 years, the most of any comedian. So all this was in Gaithersburg, Maryland, and not the sprawling city that it is today, located right at the Shady Grove Road exit of I-270, what was then US Route 240, just 2 lanes in each direction when Shady Grove opened. The hardtop structure was built almost within the shadow of and on the heels of the Washingtonian. There it is on the map, and there's a photo, it's still there today, right behind the Rio. The tent venue came first, and then developer Sam Eig built the Washingtonian Tower. Here he is on the roof, overlooking a golf course that he had built earlier. I should note that some of his residential properties had restrictive racial covenants. Homebuyers could only be whites. Eig had already built a country club and motel in that same spot. And this shows the tower actually under construction at that point, 1966. And then the next year, he built the Hardtop Music Fair, but it continued to be run by the 2 entertainment entrepreneurs who had started in the tent. I'll mention more about them later, and I'll also be referring to them as the promoters. So Sam Eig, the developer, actually had bigger plans for the area, proposed a hotel and convention center, and maybe as many as 5 other apartment skyscrapers as tall or taller than the Washingtonian. They never came about, and we're really here to talk about Shady Grove rather than this mega complex. So here's an ad for Shady Grove's arrival. Advance publicity was pretty subdued, even though they hoped Washingtonians would be, as you see here, exuberant, excited, that is, for the summer entertainment coming. And they were definitely marketing to the whole metro area. This ad was in the Washington Evening Star, which in those days was the predominant newspaper in the Washington metro area. The Post had not quite overtaken it at that point. And you see the ad here says, Shady Grove is just a 30-minute hop, skip, and 60-mile-an-hour ride from DC. Well, not entirely. The Beltway opened in bits and pieces in Montgomery County between the late 1950s and 1963. But even so, in the summer of '62, here's the tent being put up for Shady Grove's first season. Notice the sloping circular rows for the seats and then the center round stage. Brigadoon is the show that kicked it all off, starring Dorothy Collins. And here's the entire first season, 14 shows. That would be fairly typical in later years. 4 Tony winners as Best Musical. And Bye Bye Birdie had won the honors just a year earlier. Generally, Shady Grove got Tony Award-winning Best Musicals, about 3 or 4 years after they first opened. Besides Bye Bye Birdie, the only other show that Shady Grove got within a year of its getting the Best Musical Award was Company, and that was toward the end of Shady Grove's run. So after that first season, the Star called Shady Grove a major contribution to the area's summer musical scene. And the Post called it a success. The success has amazed even its own optimistic producers, who were staging solidly cast shows, smartly directed for speed on the big tent's center stage. So the next year, the second year, perhaps most notable, was The King and I. The cast ended up featuring the lead role's originator, Yul Brynner, and instead of Jane Morgan, as you see in the ad there, as originally promoted, Constance Towers, who 2 years later made her Broadway debut in the show. So also in that second season, Shady Grove started branching out. Its first musician, and a real coup, Duke Ellington, as well as 2 comedy shows, Alan King and Jackie Mason. Both had appeared on Ed Sullivan numerous times by that point. So here's the third year, 1964, the schedule as printed in the Evening Star, along with Olney Theater. That's worth noting. Olney Theater was about the only competition, local competition at that time, and generally only put on less known, though you might say more highbrow shows, definitely a different sort of appeal. As Shady Grove's promoter put it, with so many seats, Shady Grove couldn't do the serious plays. It's notable that that year was Diane Carroll, just 2 years after getting the Tony for Best Actress, the first Black woman to be so honored, the first Black female lead at Shady Grove. This was just a few years ahead of her show, TV show, Julia. And I'm told that Sidney Poitier showed up after one of the shows with a gorgeous display of flowers. There was always some talk of a thing between the two of them. So after 3 seasons now, the Star was very complimentary, saying that Shady Grove was meeting the challenge of putting on shows on a small round stage. It can be done, they said. It was still predominantly plays at this point, only one concert that summer, a very young Joan Baez, who had sung We Shall Overcome with Bob Dylan at the Civil Rights March on Washington just the year before. So next year, 1965, Duke Ellington was back along with Tony Bennett, whom you heard the ad for. 5 Tony-winning Best Musicals, though 2 were already repeats from earlier seasons. That would be a recurring theme, so to speak, as the years went on. Of the 51 shows just through 1965, the first 4 seasons, altogether 20 of those shows would be repeated in later years. But it was notable that a funny thing happened on the way to the Forum, was staged there just 2 years after the Best Musical Tony, but without Zero Mostel, who had opened in the Broadway version, though he would appear at Shady Grove in 1973 in a different show. And down there at the bottom, the last of the season, Guys and Dolls, in a small part, Goldie Hawn, who 2 years before had graduated from Montgomery Blair High School. 1966, the last year under the tent, number of firsts, a pre-Broadway play, A Joyful Noise, starring John Raitt. But A Joyful Noise had only 12 performances later on Broadway. Wikipedia says it actually was a flop. Still concerts, but 2 non-musicals. And one was a first time that Victor Borge appeared. One was a variety show starring Robert Goulet. This was Burlesque, the play I've mentioned a couple of times. It was the first time at Shady Grove, and it opened on Broadway just a year before. It was a revival of a burlesque show. But expanded concert fare now. The Dave Clark Five, the Lovin' Spoonful, for the Lovin' Spoonful, the Hangmen, a local band of then Montgomery Junior College students, opened for that group. Also Ray Charles, the Byrds, Kingston Trio, and Pete Seeger. And indeed, as time went on, the concert fare would become more important. Also in 1966 was added a summer-long children's theater, all seats $1, and that would actually continue for most of Shady Grove's run. And still the staples of Broadway shows. So here's the listing of the children's theater the following year. I said it would pretty much continue. That same year, the First Lady, Lady Bird Johnson, came out with a group of Head Start youngsters from the DC area, needy in the terminology of the day. And all the way up to 1976, still the children's theater. But in 1967, the big news was a permanent building. Here's a drawing of it that was on the cover of many playbills, and a construction photo of what was reportedly the largest free-span roof in the area at the time. Now, in contrast to the 1962 kickoff, when it was still in a tent, a much greater hoopla for this announcement. Exciting news for theater goers. Permanent year-round theater, the greatest stars, musicals, plays, fully air-conditioned, luxurious seats, finest stereo system, unobstructed views from every seat. And the lineup, well, 3 repeats already. And Diane Carroll was supposed to be back, but hold that thought. Julie Newmar, on TV at this time, she was Catwoman on the Batman TV series. Well, an interesting confluence of events or a coincidence, Eartha Kitt replaced Diane Carroll in the musical Peg, just as she had replaced Julie Newmar as Catwoman on TV. Now, this was another pre-Broadway tryout, but bad luck. Eartha Kitt collapsed during her Shady Grove performance. And when she was taken to Holy Cross Hospital, this photo was published in newspapers around the country. But as they say, the show, or in this case, the shows, plural, must go on. Instead of just a summer of musicals, the shows now could go on year-round with the permanent structure. Well, year-round theater, that is plays, really only lasted the first 2 years, but still a big deal. So here's the first fall season. Started with another burlesque show, but not as well received as the first iteration that I mentioned earlier. Another pre-Broadway show that, well, actually never made it to Broadway. But the music could certainly continue into the fall. Bobby Darin. Other concerts that year included Simon and Garfunkel. They were at the top of the charts at the time, as well as 2 groups that I've already mentioned, the Temptations and the Four Seasons. Now, about that burlesque show, the Star Review, down there on the second paragraph, a dull plotting piece of cheap theatrics stuck together with 2 name acts. Well, the 2 actresses were by this point approaching 50 years of age. Ouch, close curtain. Although with its round stage, Shady Grove didn't have a curtain. But again, the show must go on. So the next year it was back to basics. Broadway staples, some pretty big name performers, though definitely of a certain vintage, so to speak. But now Shady Grove went big on concerts. and quite an impressive list, starting with the Jefferson Airplane, the Association, the Turtles, Young Rascals, Sonny and Cher, Gladys Knight and the Pips, just to name some, Sam and Dave. But the best of all that year turned out to be the last scheduled musical in October, a surprise hit that continued on over the winter into 1969, with Shady Grove now living up to its promise of a year-round venue. It seemed that everyone wanted a ticket. Show finally closed 9 months after it opened, one of the longest running shows ever in the DC area. And then after the next summer of musicals and concerts, another surprise hit that got extended into 1970, Dames at Sea. The success that Shady Grove was having prompted the Star's critic to proclaim that suburban theater was so much better than going to downtown DC theaters. And for one thing, there's the possibility of getting clobbered by some hophead who needs cash to buy a fix. And anyone who ventured into the streets downtown, many people got banged around and robbed. And then there's the parking garage fee. There's also the unavoidable fact that a man who drives home through rush hour traffic is not eager to gulp some food down and turn around and drive back downtown again for more of the same. Well, rather dated, but truly heady times for Shady Grove. And the next decade, the 1970s, opened with more of the same, literally in some cases, given the repeats. Still a mix of musicals, concerts, and comedians. Cabaret, named Best Musical just 3 years earlier, and Man of La Mancha, Best Musical 4 years earlier. And Rowan and Martin riding high on their popular Laugh-In TV show. And among the musical performers, as you see here again, many big names. The next year, more concerts than ever, 1971. Also musicals, but no more shows had extended runs like Charlie Brown and Dames at Sea. And if this whole Shady Grove saga were a 2-act play, this would be the climax closing to Act 1. In 1971, the tide starts to turn. That same year, Wolf Trap opened across the river. Here's the ad for the opening of Wolf Trap. Theater and music, yes, direct competition in a bigger venue. Kicking it all off for Wolf Trap was the National Symphony Orchestra. Now, it's interesting to note that the NSO had just appeared at Shady Grove earlier that year, for the first time, but they would never play Shady Grove again. Generally, Wolf Trap got more varied offerings. I know you can't read all these here, but quite big names and a long list, as you see. Competition for that all-important entertainment dollars. And it's noteworthy that 1971, this year that we're speaking of, turned out to be the peak year in terms of number of concerts for Shady Grove. And then just a few months later, the Kennedy Center opened, a double whammy. Kennedy Center opened with a world premiere by Leonard Bernstein. How do you compete with the Kennedy name and the likes of Leonard Bernstein? And well, despite that world premiere, over time, Broadway classics would become a big part of the Kennedy Center's fare. So again, more competition. Undaunted initially, Shady Grove stuck with its formula of popular Broadway shows. Fiddler on the Roof and Hello, Dolly, two recent best musicals. And Zero Mostel finally came to Shady Grove, but in a funny thing happened on the way to the Forum, not in perhaps his better known role in Fiddler on the Roof. Meanwhile, on the other side of the house, the musicians, Shady Grove, in some ways, ratcheted it up. Some star power attractions here over the next several years. 1975, in fact, nearly matched 1971 as the most concerts in one year. Remember, I'm just showing you a sampling here. But the number of musicals had declined significantly beginning in 1974. That was just 3 years after the opening of Wolf Trap and the Kennedy Center. Now, I mentioned several of these performers. First, the Temptations and the Supremes. Interesting that the Temptations got top billing. That was because Diana Ross had left the Supremes by this point. The Steve Miller concert in 1973 is worth mentioning. For one thing, the band's song, The Joker, had hit #1 just the week before. For another thing, you can find the soundtrack for this concert online.
You ready? 1, 2, 3,
Well, not quite the mellow music of Andy Williams, but opening for the Steve Miller Band was Grin with Nils Lofgren, a Walter Johnson High School student who left in his senior year to form the group. Now, this concert is one of the few times that there was trouble at Shady Grove. I'll summarize this. A rock and bottle throwing disturbance. The trouble began when the first of 2 concerts ran long. 40 policemen were called out, 8 arrests. County officials wanted a guarantee that something like this wouldn't happen again. Well, it was almost a moot point because a much larger venue, 7 times the size of Shady Grove, opened just a month later for both sports events and concerts. And it's interesting to note that the first concert, the Allman Brothers, just 2 nights after the first Bullets basketball game, now the Wizards, first concert was the Allman Brothers. And they had played Shady Grove back 3 years earlier, 1970. So it was questionable whether Shady Grove was really going to get as many big names like that. Well, they did get the Jackson 5 for those 7 nights, quite remarkable. And by the way, DJs from WRC Radio, then a top 40 station, played a basketball game against the Jacksons. The guys with the cool dance moves won the game. But the Jackson 5 were the exceptional big name performers that Shady Grove could get by this point. For example, it was definitely a young Bruce Springsteen who appeared the year before. This was just before his breakout album, Born to Run. And it would be a decade later that his now classic Born in the USA came out. But even so, the Washington Post noted that in its review, it was quickly apparent from this concert why Springsteen is soon going to be a name to be reckoned with. And indeed, he later, just the next year, appeared elsewhere, a bigger venue, Carter Barron, the open air venue in Rock Creek Park. There's a photo of this concert on a Smithsonian website of all places, and that's the caption that goes along with it on the web. But later, a sharp drop-off in the number of concerts and plays in 1976 and 77. Blood, Sweat, and Tears, well, their hits mostly in the late 60s, early 70s. Bette Midler, well, this was early in her career. Tina Turner, well, she was just beginning her comeback after splitting with Ike. And well, I'll come back to Sonny and Cher in a minute. But as for Tina Turner, she was the opening act for Ben Vereen and got only a small mention at the end of a Washington Post article about Vereen. It was like, oh yeah, appearing with Vereen was Tina Turner, making her first Washington area appearance since the breakup of her marriage and loss of her artistic partner, Ike Turner. At first, her newly developed act seemed like an updated and corny version of vaudeville, with a little country and western material thrown in. But still gyrating with bountiful bumps and grinds, Tina warmed to her task, and the audience lost its initial reserve as she launched into old Turner favorites such as Proud Mary and I Want to Take You Higher. In fact, this Shady Grove appearance marked her very first solo appearance anywhere for the later superstar. Now, Sonny and Cher, by this time, 1977, I'm showing an ad here from 1972 when they had appeared, but 1977 really represented a throwback, though Cher would boom again. In 1977, they had appeared at Shady Grove 3 times, this ad and ticket, as I said, from 1972. They first appeared at Shady Grove, 1968, that was around their I Got You Babe days. And then again in 1973, their popular TV show was on at that time. But by 1977, well, the and in Sonny and Cher didn't apply. They had filed for divorce by the time they appeared at Shady Grove. 2 other connections to TV shows, return engagements for both, 4th time for both, in fact. Sanford and Son was in the middle of its 5-year TV run, and Rowan and Martin again, well, Laugh-In had ended its 5-year TV run 2 years earlier, and the Star said that they were staging a yawn-in at Shady Grove with warmed over routines that landed with a thud and left many fans disappointed. Much the same was said of Shady Grove's far fewer number of plays in 1975, A Little Dusty, and 1976, Elderly Student Prince, Merry Widow has grown a trifle aged. And even when Shady Grove got adventurous, it was panned by both the Star, how soon today's shocker becomes yesterday's ho-hum, and also panned by the Post. Times have changed. Slogans now seem about as obscene as some bumper stickers. And things were falling flat, you might say. And in a way that was foretold a couple of years earlier when Marlene Dietrich, age 72, literally fell into the orchestra pit at the end of a performance. An attendee caught this sequence. She was reaching down to shake the hand of the orchestra conductor. Anyway, Shady Grove's name was in papers again around the country, not a terribly flattering way. Shady Grove itself had equally fallen on hard times. 1976, fewer number of shows, and quite a number of them ended up being canceled. 1977, just 4 musicals scheduled. And again, musical performers, at least 1 cancellation. And finally, the end came in early 1978. The promoters said that they couldn't compete anymore, presumably because of the Kennedy Center, Wolf Trap, and the Capitol Center. Even a bit more local competition. Now, I had mentioned Olney Theater, wasn't really direct competition, but what became Roundhouse Theater, it opened in 1970 and then got a permanent home when it moved into an old round school, which gave it its name. Shady Grove was torn down 4 years after the closing was announced. So Gaithersburg no longer in the spotlight. But it's interesting to note that a couple of years before it closed, Shady Grove had tried some rebranding, you might say. It billed itself as the Washington area's year-round theater. No longer Shady Grove Music Theater, not Shady Grove Music Fair, changing its name. And it apparently moved from Gaithersburg to Rockville. Here's its first playbill again, when you might say it knew where it was. Maybe from Broadway to Rockville sounded better. Now it's true, Rockville was expanding at this point, annexing more land, but its borders never really extended to the theater building itself. Perhaps its virtual move, you might say, was to take advantage of the hopeful rebirth of Rockville at this time. Rockville underwent urban renewal in the early 1970s, symbolized by the Rockville Mall, but it turned out to be a failure, and it was demolished about 2 decades after it opened, the same fate as Shady Grove. Now, I should note that as the largest venue in Montgomery County, Shady Grove hosted other events from time to time and by other organizations. So these were not official Shady Grove Music Fair branded events, but not put on by the promoters I mentioned, but other organizations as well. And also, Shady Grove hosted graduations of numerous Montgomery County high schools, including mine. At another, then Vice President Gerald Ford spoke at Paint Branch's graduation at Shady Grove. Jesse Jackson, 2 years later, for Sherwood High School. Even Montgomery College, no longer Montgomery Junior College, but turning out graduates, held its commencement there sometimes. I'm told the last was Gaithersburg High School in 1978, and one grad said by that point the ceiling was falling down. Perhaps you remember the 1968 County Public School Teachers Strike. The membership met at Shady Grove to finally vote on a settlement, about a week long. And Marriott shareholders also met there. Now, I showed a number of playbills. Some lucky fans got theirs autographed. They sometimes crop up on eBay. And about Peggy Fleming appeared at Shady Grove 2 times, and actually a ice skating rink was on the round center stage. Now, some of the, you could buy more colorful souvenir brochures, and again, some autographed. And there's the program for the last musical, Camelot, starring Rock Hudson. And of course, there's the line from Camelot, "Don't let it be forgot that there once was a spot called Shady Grove Music Fair, where the stars came to Gaithersburg." Well, it's interesting to look inside a lot of these playbills. At the ads, remember Drug Fair? Well, it had some difficulty with an apostrophe there in the first line, but it got it correct a little later on. And that was important since there's a big difference. They wanted you to know that there was a big difference from a drug fair compared to the big guys, People's Drug Store, later CVS, of course. Lots of ads for restaurants and eateries. Maybe some of you hung out at Ernie's. Your money could earn a lot more interest in those days, though inflation, it's rearing its ugly head again. Early computers, if you will. And those were the days of the ubiquitous VW Beetle and bus. And did you notice the car dealer on many of the covers of the playbills? The only other advertiser on the cover of a playbill that I found was for a beer, and perhaps significantly on the playbill for one of the burlesque revivals. What wasn't well advertised at the time was that Shady Grove was actually one of a number of such music fair venues, part of a chain on the East Coast. The promoters that I've mentioned were mainly 2 Philadelphia men who actually met in homeroom in high school. Notice how close their last names were alphabetically. In the early days, there was a third partner as well. Here are the three, and there's a list of all the other venues. Their first venue was a tent just outside of Philadelphia in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, and almost like a template. Then it went hardtop, though not until after Shady Grove. It did last much longer than Shady Grove, however, all the way up until 1996. The largest of these venues was on Long Island outside New York City. It opened as a tent a year after Valley Forge and then went hardtop a year before Shady Grove did. Now, the interior of this was virtually the same as Shady Grove, though 200 more seats. And in fact, this was what I showed for Shady Grove's interior, because no photo of the inside of Shady Grove has turned up, but they were similar, if not identical. And this Westbury, New York Music Fair is the only one of these venues that survives. It's been remodeled and renamed, had different owners. There was also one outside Baltimore, ultimately destroyed by fire. So here's the whole family. Also one in outside Springfield, Massachusetts, and one in New Jersey. The same plays would cycle through all these venues over the course of a season. Orchestras and tech crews traveled with the shows rather than having locally hired musicians. So what's on the spot of where Shady Grove once stood, an office park? A friend of mine likes to say that they paved paradise. But inside one of those buildings, a reminder of when the stars came to Gaithersburg. Gladys Knight and the Pips. Well, Stevie Wonder, as far as I have found, did not appear at Shady Grove. And as far as I know, Elvis never appeared at Shady Grove, unless there were later sightings. It's not all the stars came to Gaithersburg. Perhaps the biggest, the Beatles, never appeared, but there is a connection of sorts. The only US talk show appearance by the two most famous of the Fab Four, Paul McCartney and John Lennon, was on The Tonight Show. But host Johnny Carson was at Shady Grove. So Paul asks substitute host Joe Gargiola, remember, "Where's Johnny?" And Gargiola replies, "Gaithersburg, a wonderful town." And Johnny proved quite wonderful in Gaithersburg. His 8 appearances over 2 weekends ended up being the highest grossing attraction for Shady Grove. But Carson missed out on that bit of Beatle history, our only appearance on an American TV talk show. And notice the other substitute hosts there on the far right, Barbara Walters. Another coincidence. She had once been married to one of the music fair partners. And I'm told she was responsible for some of the more risque fare, you might say, because her father had been a burlesque show producer. So that's a look back at Shady Grove Music Fair, quite an institution. I've compiled as best I could all the shows, concerts, and other performers, color-coded here, musicals in red, musicians in blue, and then on the gold there, the last page, all the big name performers who appeared. And I'll make that available to Dottie if you're interested. So there's a website with a lot of memories. I hope we get some memories tonight. I'll close with this one that was on the website. A person wrote in, "I saw Sonny and Cher at Shady Grove." Remember, they appeared 3 times. In 2010, I attended a Cher show at Caesar's Palace in Las Vegas. I was invited to meet her afterwards, and I told her, "I saw you and Sonny at Shady Grove." she responded, "Oh my goodness, that was so long ago, in the round." And the person who posted this wrote, "Even the world-class entertainers who performed there remember Shady Grove." So thanks very much. I'll stop share now. Give a number of talks for Montgomery History, the countywide history preservation organization, and tentatively one scheduled for I think it's second Tuesday in May, not yet on their website, but if you're interested. The early history of a different community starting with P in Montgomery County, early history of Potomac. So thanks everyone, and we do indeed invite questions or memories.
Feel free to leave your questions in the chat or unmute and ask them.
Oh, one person writes, "I love the ticket prices." Yes, it also gives you a sense of the big difference. And on some of the tickets, you may have noticed a 25-cent parking fee was included. That was some kind of arrangement that the 25 cents went, I can't remember, but it had to be broken out for union reasons, and went specifically for something else. Truly an affordable venue. Anyone want to mention any performer they may have seen there in particular? To get you going, I first gave this talk at the Montgomery History annual conference, which is held every January. And John Kelly in the Washington Post was kind enough to write a sort of preview about it. And so a number of people contacted me. One person remembers being in the tent in early years for the Music Man during a rainstorm, and said it rained so hard you could hardly hear the performers. A tech crew, and one of the first in one of the original tech crews contacted me. He was at Shady Grove for the opening night in 1962. That was Brigadoon. He said the star, Dorothy Collins, was very nice. He added, unlike other actors he met over time. He also noted that coming down from one of the other venues further north, the crew was refused service at a Maryland highway diner because one crew member was Black. Remember, that was the early 1960s. So some other memories here: graduation, 77 high school graduation, Bruce Springsteen. Remember seeing Godspell, I didn't mention that. My husband saw the Temptations, Chubby Checker. I don't think I'd mentioned Chubby Checker. Used to 10 bar at the Washingtonian, yes, and often in those, in the playbills, there was a special deal if you had dinner either before or after the performance at the Washingtonian. And someone did see Camelot with Rock Hudson, the last musical. Carol.
I just wanted to say, I thought it was absolutely so cool how many of the playbills that you had, and even the radio clip talking about people coming to perform there. I mean, your presentations always have so much of that like firsthand content, which really makes it come alive. It was very, very cool.
Thank you. It was a lot of fun researching this, needless to say. Brought back a lot of memories for me too.
I saw Bruce Springsteen there, and the opening act was Martin Mull, and he almost got killed because nobody expected this guy to come out, and he pretended like he played a guitar, but he was really a comic, and people got so upset that he didn't get any more than 2 or 3 bars into the song before he told the joke, and they started throwing shoes and stuff at him. They did not.
The person they'd come to see, apparently.
Well, not when they came to see Bruce Springsteen. No, it wasn't.
Yes.
A
couple other memories. Someone remembers the Bette Midler show. She was apparently wheeled down an aisle on a stretcher only to bound off and start her show. And someone else said, one actress changed her costume in a semi-darkened aisle because the dressing rooms were so far from the round stage. And you saw all the seats around them. The audience member said it was like she was stripping right next to me. So many, many different memories of Shady Grove. I got interested in this topic not only because my graduation was there, but I was just driving on 270 one day and thought, well, where exactly was Shady Grove? I had it in my head that it was inside the clover leaf there at Shady Grove Road, but of course that would make no sense. That would not be safe at all. It was just off to the side as you continue down Shady Grove Road, crossing I-270 from Home Depot. And that's where the office park is today.
It's so cool to compare the then and now. I mean, aside from DC, stars that big are not coming to Montgomery County most of the time. So it's very neat to hear about a time when it was so popular specifically for that. I see another comment in the chat.
Yes, is that Jim and Rosie perhaps? Anyway, our family went to many shows. Gaithersburg High School class of 1970 graduated there. Yes, many. Mickey Rooney, yes, I think you probably saw his name on one of the playbills, came to the Pancake Cottage in Rockville. Boy, I don't even remember that restaurant, while performing, and introduced himself and his wife to the staff. Saw Temptations, Gladys Knight and the Pips, Bette Midler, fantastic. And many others, I'm sure.
Do we have any last questions? Well, as always, if you think of any questions later, you can email us at info@poolesvilleseniors.org and we can pass them on for you. I hope you all enjoyed tonight's presentation as much as I did and learned something new. And if you'd like to unmute or turn on your camera to say goodbye, now's the time. We'd like to thank Ralph for his presentation, as well as our ongoing sponsors and private contributors, which help us keep our programs going because we love putting them on for you. And if you enjoyed tonight's program, please consider joining us for more upcoming events. We will be back this time next week with Earth Day with Poolesville Green Inc. So come along and get to know them. And as always, you can go to our website, poolesvilleseniors.org, for more info and registration for all of our events. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight and have a great evening.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
That was fabulous.
everyone.
Very much.